I'm Faz Shakir.
I'm Amanda Litman, and this is Battleground. Faz is still gone this week, spending time with his very cute new baby. Our guest this week is David Daley. He's the author of Ratf, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, and Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. I think redistricting and the process in 2010 in the state legislative elections that led to the redistricting crisis we're in now is one of the most, it's somehow both over-discussed and under-discussed political stories of this moment. Like, we literally can't talk about it enough, in part because I think the people who control the mechanisms to fix it don't seem to understand how much of a crisis it is. So we'll get into that in a little bit. I want to just start by defining some terms. So let's do quick. The difference between reapportionment and redistricting.
Reapportionment is when the number of House seats that each state has is adjusted for population after the census. Redistricting is when every state legislative and congressional seat is redrawn every 10 years after the census.
And gerrymandering is
when partisan politicians take advantage of the process of redistricting to draw lines that lock in an advantage for themselves for the next decade.
And can you give us a very TLDR history of gerrymandering?
Patrick Henry tries to gerrymander James Madison out of our very first Congress. As long as we've had politicians, they have tried to rig the lines to give themselves advantages. It is oddly, however, a uniquely American problem. Other countries around the world do not district the same way. They don't let politicians have control over this process. There was a governor of Massachusetts named Elbridge Gerry who in 1812, his party, the Democratic Republicans, tried to draw lines for the state Senate districts around Boston in such a way as to screw once again the hated Federalists out of the seats that they thought they'd win that fall. And one of those districts in the Boston area resembled a salamander to a political cartoonist. And so Elbridge Gerry goes down as the father of gerrymandering. While we have had gerrymandering for hundreds and hundreds of years, it really explodes in 2010. And that is because really of two things. I would say one is the political intention that Republican Party operatives recognized after the big blue waves of 06, of 08, the demographic trends that were not heading in their direction. They realized that they needed a strategy, a path back to power. And they saw that the 2010 election, being a census year, that if they could redistrict in such a way as to give themselves an edge, that would be very valuable at a time in which the country was heading politically in the other direction. But also it's because the sophistication of the map-making software, the power of the computers, and just the granular nature of the big data that is available to map makers in 2010 is of a magnitude of the like that, Patrick Henry and Elbridge Gerry didn't have this, but the folks who were drawing lines in 2000 didn't have it either. There's a quantum leap between 2000 and 2010. The term on steroids is overused, but that's exactly what it is.
So there's a couple of different levers folks can pull, in particular Republicans tend to pull when they're thinking about the gerrymandering and redistricting process. There's the technology that they use, which you just touched on. There's the partisan sort of nature of the process of who gets to control drawing the maps, which we'll get to a little bit. But there's also the underlying data, which comes from the census. And the 2020 census data, we conducted it during a pandemic, one might recall. It was bad. And it was bad both because of the pandemic and also because of the Trump administration's intentional effort to rig the count. How do you feel about how the Census Bureau ultimately managed this task? And do you feel like the numbers are accurate?
It appears that the numbers are accurate. The basic population numbers appear to line up with the estimates of where folks imagined that they would. The collision of that census data with the redistricting process is what I think we have to worry about. Because what the census data shows is a population that is growing slowly, but that almost all of that population growth is due to Latino and Asian voters. And it's especially due to Latino and Asian voters across the Sun Belt. So whether you're talking about North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Arizona, Texas, this is really where the population is changing. It's where the population is growing. Many of those states are the ones that received additional congressional seats through reapportionment. And those are states where Republicans effectively control every lever of redistricting. So these population trends are on a collision course with Republican control of redistricting in all of these key states, with a 5-seat Democratic advantage in the U.S. House. The census shows us becoming an ever more diverse multiracial nation. This process will determine whether we can actually become a multiracial democracy. And there are a lot of forces that appear to be lined up in the way of that.
It's not a secret why they are doing this. They don't want people of color and young people generally to vote, because if they vote, they probably won't win.
It's not a secret why they're doing it. And it's not a secret how easy it is to use this process to get away with it. I mean, in 2011, Texas wins 4 additional seats in the U.S. House through reapportionment. And something like 90% of the population growth that drove those 4 seats in Texas was due to communities of color. And Texas Republicans drew a map that not only failed to create a single additional opportunity district for candidates of color, but took one of the old ones away. And so this is what we're looking at this time, right? I mean, Texas is up by 4 million people. More than half of that is Latino voters alone. What are the maps going to look like? I mean, Florida is up by 2 million people. 54% of that growth in Florida, Latino voters alone. How are our districts going to be drawn that reflect that changing personality? Or will Republicans draw districts that solidify their incumbents and pack Democrats and communities of color into as few districts as possible? Given what happened last time around, I think we've got a little bit of foreshadowing as to what the answer will be this time.
Do you think we are underselling the power of RedMap from 2010? And can you define RedMap for folks who might not be familiar?
RedMap is the Redistricting Majority Project. It created exactly what it was named after. Republicans recognized that state legislatures provided the road to power because state legislatures control these maps in about 75% of our states. So what Republicans did in 2010 is they focused on winning back state legislative chambers in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Indiana. And they invested $30 million down ballot in these local races. And in the last 6 weeks or so of the campaign, all of the focus group research into sort of the negative issues that would work was unleashed. Hundreds of thousands of dollars dumped into these local races, drowned and swamped incumbents who never saw it coming. Republicans took over the chambers, remapped the following year, and Democrats could not take back a single one of those chambers in any one of those states or any of the other ones for the next decade to come, even when they won hundreds of thousands more votes. Democrats did not win back a single seat in our most gerrymandered states. Nothing in North Carolina in 2018, nothing in Ohio, nothing in Wisconsin. By 2020, you had courts overturn Republican maps in Florida, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Virginia. Republicans would have held the House in 2020 if not for those 2 lawsuits that forced fair maps in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. This is the impact of gerrymandering. Republicans lost the popular vote for the U.S. House in 2020 by 4.7 million votes. But had those lawsuits in 2 states gone the other way, it's a 218-217 House. The idea that gerrymandering is overblown is just absolute bullshit.
It makes me so angry when folks from the White House say, well, Democrats just have to out-organize the gerrymander. You just got to work harder. You cannot out-organize a gerrymander.
Democrats have to win by these huge numbers to have even a shot at a slender majority. And that's why you can't out-organize this. You can't outwork a partisan gerrymander. And when you add voter suppression on top of that, in some of these states like Georgia and Arizona and Wisconsin, that 10, 15,000 votes is the difference between them going red and blue in the 2020 election. Instead of passing a law, they're trying to tell us to out-organize and outwork it.
I mean, this is why people like you and I are losing our minds a little bit, because it feels like we're being gaslit.
We are. Democrats, Republicans, independents, everybody hates partisan gerrymandering. They could pass a law that is popular, or they can lose the House maybe for a decade. You tell me what they're going to choose.
Thanks for watching. You can get the full episode of Battleground on the Recount streaming daily, or listen to it wherever you get your podcasts.